Hello and welcome to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive community online. This video is a part of our Silmarillion guide series, which offers a quick and easy to understand introduction to the events, characters, and world of the Silmarillion for first or second time readers. This guide is also available as a free ebook, which can be downloaded at teawithtolkien.com/shop. To learn more about Tea with Tolkien or to support my work via Patreon, please visit teawithtolkien.com or patreon.com/teawithtolkien. The Waldman Letter, also known as Letter 131, framing the Silmarillion in context with the Waldman Letter. The Waldman Letter is a letter written by J.R.R. Tolkien to Milton Waldman, an editor and advisor to publishers who had expressed an interest in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion after the widespread success of The Hobbit. For context, let's look at the timeline of this whole situation. The Hobbit was published in 1937, this letter was written in 1951, and The Fellowship of the Ring would not be published until 1954. Unfortunately, the Silmarillion itself was not published until 1977 after Tolkien's death. Tolkien had hoped to publish The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion together, and this letter reflects his belief that the two were interdependent. This letter is important because it pieces together all of Tolkien's stories concerning Middle-earth, showing how they are all a part of the same great tale. This letter can be read in a few places. In part on the Tolkien Estate website, though there is a large chunk missing in the middle in which Tolkien writes about the creation of his world and its history through the Second Age. You can check out the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, where it is listed as Letter 131, or you can find this letter in the Preface to the Silmarillion, although this is in the second edition only. So what's in the Waldman Letter? Let's briefly summarize it before getting into our detailed outline. Tolkien writes that he cannot remember when he wasn't building his imaginary world or its languages, noting that almost all of the names in his world are derived from these languages. This gives his work a specific kind of consistency that others may not have. Tolkien also writes that he has always been passionate about myth, desiring a myth that could be uniquely English. Tolkien states that the three major themes of his work are fall, mortality, and machine. He then goes on to write about the magic of the elves as art versus the enemy's use of machine. And then after that, he launches into a summary of his world's history from its creation all the way through its third age. Now let's get into a more detailed discussion of what's in the Waldman Letter. Please note that this letter contains spoilers for the plot of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien begins with an explanation as to why he's writing the letter, which allows us a bit more context. He writes, "My dear Milton, you asked for a brief sketch of my stuff that is connected with my imaginary world." He writes that he's always been building his imaginary world and languages for as long as he can remember, and that these languages are at the heart of his legendarium. At the same time, he writes, an equally basic passion of Tolkien's was myth and heroic legend. Because of this, he had hoped to create something uniquely English and dedicate it to his country. Despite being a devout Catholic, Tolkien notes that he felt it was fatal for the Arthurian myths to explicitly contain Christianity within their framework. Tolkien writes, "For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, this seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary real world." Tolkien goes on to explain that it was once his vision to create an entire body of myth which he could dedicate to his country. He describes how he would like to present his body of work, drawing some of its tales in their fullness while leaving room for others to contribute along the line. This line is often cited when the topic of adaptation comes up, so it's a good one to pay attention to. Tolkien writes, "I would draw some of the great tales in fullness and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Then he finishes the line by saying, absurd. He also explains that he feels the stories within his legendarium arose as given things. He never felt he was inventing this world, but rather recording its history, which is very interesting. After all of this is out of the way, Tolkien gets into the major themes of his stuff, as he calls it. Tolkien writes, anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine. Tolkien explains his usage of the word machine as it relates more closely to our modern usage of the word magic. He writes, the machine is our more obvious modern form, though more closely related to magic than is usually recognized. It's then that we get the distinction between the magic of the enemy versus the magic of the elves. He explains that the magic of the enemy is this bulldozing of the real world, coercing other wills, whereas the magic of the elves is a cooperation or even fulfillment. The magic of the elves is also called art. This comes into play when he discusses the motivation seen throughout the different incarnations of evil throughout the legendarium. Tolkien writes, the enemy in successive forms is always naturally concerned with sheer domination, and so the Lord of Magic and Machines. But the problem, that this frightful evil can and does arrive from an apparently good root, the desire to benefit the world and others, speedily and according to the benefactor's own plans, is a recurrent motive. From there, he dives into a discussion of the mythology he had written in its chronology, beginning with the music of the Ainur. So this section is a bit of a recap, but we'll go through it anyway. We have the creation of the world through music, and then the story moves into the elves and eventually men. Don't forget the dwarves too. As mortality is one of the story's major themes, Tolkien explains the way that immortality works for the elves and how it's different from the gift of men, which is death. He then explains that the focus of the Silmarillion and the perspective from which it's told is of the elves, so we aren't going to talk about men too much. Tolkien then introduces the fall, which allows the story to begin. He writes, in the cosmogony there is a fall of the angels we should say, though quite different in form, of course, to that of the Christian myth. This fall is different from other myths, though it must inevitably contain a large measure of ancient widespread motives of elements. After all, Tolkien writes, I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. Tolkien argues that there cannot be any story without a fall, saying all stories are ultimately about the fall. So after discussing the early fall of Morgoth, Tolkien explains that in this story, the elves have a fall, which comprises the main body of the Silmarillion proper. But Tolkien notes that the first fall of men does not appear in the Silmarillion. The basic story of the elves is then told: the exile of the Noldor, their re-entry into Middle-earth, and their strife with the enemy, Morgoth. This continues through the ending of the Silmarillion with the end of the First Age. Moving on into the Second Age, Tolkien explains that there are three themes of the Second Age: the delaying of the elves, Sauron's growth as a new lord, and the fall of Numenor. He writes of Sauron's influence on the elves in the Second Age, and this is very, very interesting if you're interested in studying the character of Sauron. He writes, but many of the elves listened to Sauron. He was still fair in that early time, and his motives and those of the elves seemed to go partly together. The healing of the desolate lands. Sauron found their weak point in suggesting that, helping one another, they could make Western Middle-earth as beautiful as Valinor. Tolkien then writes about the Ringverse and its connection to the story as a whole. He walks the readers through the strengths and weaknesses of Sauron as he has poured himself into this physical object. Ultimately, he has really weakened himself through this act of hubris, which will eventually end in his downfall. Next, Tolkien discusses the downfall of Numenor. The downfall of Numenor is really presented as a result of their response to the ban of the Valar. Rather than accepting mortality as a gift, they see it as the denial of something good, something which perhaps they deserve. Perhaps they are even owed it, they begin to think. Tolkien writes that their reward is their undoing, or at least the means of their temptation. He then explains that there are three phases to this fall. So ultimately, when Sauron is brought to Numenor, he comes as a prisoner, but quickly worms his way into the ear of the king. It's in this part of the letter where we get a slight discrepancy between this letter and in the Akalabaith, which is ultimately the finished story that is edited by Tolkien's son Christopher. So I want to clarify that this must have been a change that was ultimately made either later in Tolkien's life or by Christopher at the end. So this letter refers to Tar Kalion the Golden, 13th king in the line of Elroth. Tar Kalion would have been Ar-Pharazôn's name if he would have adopted his Quenya name, but he also ends up being the 25th ruler of Numenor and not the 13th. So that's a small thing, but it might be confusing to those who have read the Akalwaith, so it's good to keep that in mind. If you have no idea what I just said, don't worry because we'll get to it later. Tolkien writes of the new religion that emerged in Numenor under the direction of Sauron, which ultimately led to the breaking of the Ban of the Valar, the destruction of the island, and the reshaping of the world. Now the survivors of the downfall fled to Middle-earth to start anew, ultimately joining in the last alliance against Sauron. After this, Sauron is apparently vanquished, and the ring is kept by Isildur. The Third Age then begins with the diminishing of the men of Numenor and Middle-earth, as their realms are weakened and divided. Hobbits then begin to appear in the history of the Third Age, and it's in this section that Tolkien recounts the story of The Hobbit, then he describes its sequel, The Lord of the Rings. He also notes the difference in tone and perspective between the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, which is interesting. And after all of this, Tolkien ends the letter by writing, "I wonder if, even legible, will you ever read this?" with 2 question marks. And I love the way that he ends it, and I'm going to wrap it up now here. This is a little bit disorganized of an overview, but the letter itself is a little bit disorganized as well, and that's not a criticism. I love Tolkien. In our next video, we will discuss the Ainulindale and the Valaquenta.